Welcome back, everyone. Today on the podcast, we have a very special guest. This is my father. This is why the last couple days I haven't had a regular update video. He flew out to visit me and stay with me for a couple days. We've been actually house hunting. I'm looking to buy my first home ever here in Las Vegas. And since I have my father here, let's do a podcast episode. Do you want to say hi?
Good afternoon. Nice to be with you today, Jake.
So let's start with where and when were you born?
Well, I was born in 1953. I'm 70, or I should say my knees are 70. The rest of me is doing much better than my knees. I was born in the Netherlands. I'm an immigrant. I came to the United States in 1956 with my parents and my older brother. We ended up settling in the Midwest here in the United States, and I was born in Utrecht. My dad was from Utrecht. My mother was from Southern Holland. She was from Schijndel.
And you would say that as a kid growing up, Dutch was your first language?
Yes, it was. Although I don't remember speaking Dutch. I must have obviously learned Dutch. I came here when I was almost 4. So from my memory, I always remember speaking English, but not Dutch. But I think I've been told that somewhere back in my lizard brain there is Dutch, and when I do go back to the Netherlands, which I've done several times, it's true, it does come out. So
when you and Opa and Oma came here, you came as World War II refugees.
Yes, my immigration status was a refugee. And I'm not sure how that was established, but that's what it was. And we came here 8 years after the end of World War II. Both my parents survived World War II, obviously, and it was difficult times, obviously, for everyone in the Netherlands, because they were occupied for 5.5 years, I believe, by the Nazis. And my mother was, I think, 12 when the war started. My dad, I think, was 16. So, whenever I think my life has been difficult, which it hasn't, I think of my parents in their formative years being chased around by Nazi soldiers.
And you said that Grandpa, when he was a teenager, was picked up by the Nazis and had to go work in a munitions factory?
Well, he had a choice to make, I think, as a lot of other Dutch men, young men, had to make. Stay in Holland and starve, or go to Germany and clean up bomb damage, because obviously the German men were all either dead or fighting. So yeah, he did spend some time, I believe, in Darmstadt. Survived the bombing in Darmstadt, and had some pretty horrific stories about his experiences there. He never, neither he or my mom ever really dwelled on the war. They were, I think, grateful to survive it and move on. So
overall, a good decision to move to the United States in the 1950s?
Well, they came here at a time when the 50s were a great decade, obviously, for this country. There was a lot of economic activity, a lot of opportunity, and I think all in all, they made the right decision to come here. We left family behind. I was an adult before I really ever met most of my family members, who all remained back in the Netherlands.
So how many siblings did your dad have?
Dad had, you're going to put me on the spot now. Let's see. He had 4 brothers, and he had 1 sister, and his who was the youngest, and his sister moved with her family they moved to Canada. First they moved to Australia, and then they moved to Canada, where they still live, and they raised their kids, and they're Canadian citizens. I'm still a Dutch citizen. I never naturalized. I have a green card, and I travel on a Dutch passport. I think the Dutch passport gets me to about 195 countries around the world. Not that I'm ever going to see that many, but I think you're pretty safe traveling as someone from the Netherlands, as opposed to someone from the U.S. But I consider myself an American, even though I'm not a naturalized citizen. I pay taxes here. I served in its military. I was even though I enlisted, I was drafted during the Vietnam era. So yeah.
What year did you turn 18?
I turned 18 in 1971.
And when was the last year of the Vietnam draft?
Well, and again, my memory's a little foggy, but I think that I received a draft number in February of 1972. I believe that was the last year of the draft. I had a horrible draft number. My number was 15. And
so you were going to get drafted, and most likely
I was toast. Yeah, I was going to be drafted. I was convinced I was going to be drafted, and so I ended up enlisting. I did the calculation. My time would be better spent as an enlisted serviceman than a draftee.
So just to clarify that, you're not a United States citizen. You're a permanent resident with a green card,
Right.
but all permanent residents still have to register for the selective services and are eligible to be drafted.
Well, in those days, you had to, when you turned 18, you had to register for the draft. And so that in the event of a conflict of some sort, that you could be called up, and so myself and other 18-year-olds, we all had to register, and because I held a green card, I was a legal resident alien. I ended up registering and entered the selective service system, the draft system, which was started up, I believe, in 1969, and it ran till 1972. So, the war ended in 1973, and when the last Americans pulled out of Saigon, and then ultimately the war ended in 75. For me, that whole decade, that era was a defining decade for me, and an important decade, obviously, the 60s, coming of age there. So
where were you stationed, and what was your career field?
Well, I just to back up a little bit, I tried to enlist when I made the decision to not be drafted. I ended up enlisting. I went to a neighboring town, and where I lived, and tried to enlist in the Army. And I went twice to the recruiter's office, and both times I was there, the recruiter was out to lunch, so he was closed. So after the second time, I said, "Forget this. This is the way the Army runs its affairs. I'm going to enlist in the Air Force." So I went to a different recruiter's office, an Air Force recruiter, and I ended up enlisting in the Air Force. So. And my younger brother told me sometime later that a draft notice had come, and but by then I was gone. I was already in the military. So when I enlisted, they sent me originally to Lackland Air Base in San Antonio. I did my basic training there, which I believe was about 6 weeks. I always thought Air Force was like Army Light. That's what I always called it. And then after basic training, I ended up going to Shepherd Air Base in northern Texas, in Wichita Falls.
This is for your tech school?
For tech school.
For
yes.
what?
Well, when I enlisted, they asked me, well, what do you want to do? because we had a choice of our career fields. If there was something that interested us, they'd like to see you in that field. So I had tested fairly high on an intelligence level. Now I know it's hard to believe looking at me now, but I actually tested pretty high, so I qualified for an engineering job, and it was called site developer. And so I went to technical school for engineering support. So I was a draftsman, I was a land surveyor, whatever architects and engineers needed help with. That's where that's how I trained, and I loved my job. I really enjoyed the learning portion of technical school.
You just didn't like being a square with short hair.
Yes, yes. Well, hair grows back, memories fade, you know.
But everybody in the early 1970s knew you were in the military. You couldn't hide it.
No. In those days, everybody had hair. All the men looked like Jesus Christ, I suppose. And of course, if you were in the military, you had very, very short hair. So you were hard. It was hard to when you left base to feel like you were out of the military. So and then after technical school, I was transferred to Southern California, where I ended up serving for 3.5 years at Norton Air Base.
And Norton Air Base is not there anymore.
No, Jake and I were there several years ago, and I had heard that it had closed, and so
it's been converted into like a regional airport.
Yes, now it's
San Bernardino Regional Airport.
That's correct. And so yeah, it was fun going back there and seeing where I had served. But many of the buildings were gone and replaced, and so they moved on. But that town, I think, was rocked when Norton closed.
So overall, it was. So once again, to highlight the option my dad had at 19, either you wait to be drafted for 2 years, and you're probably going to be drafted into the Army or Marines, sent to Vietnam, or you can enlist, and you can have more control over what you do, but you have to serve for 4 years. So
that's correct.
My dad at 19 had, a difficult choice, but went with the 4, and it was a good experience. Like you lost 4 years of your life. You didn't want to be doing that, but overall, you got good benefits.
Well, that's true. I went to college on the GI Bill. I got an undergraduate degree and master's degree on the GI Bill. They were very helpful.
Did you use the VA loan for your house?
And yes, I got I bought a house in 1979 when people my age would remember interest rates in those days was I think 17% for a home loan.
17% for a mortgage in 1979.
Right. Yeah, it was horrendous, and so I got a state VA loan. In fact, it was the last one in our state for 7.2%, and which was just a miracle. So it allowed me to buy a home at a time when I could not have afforded to buy a home. And so yeah, I have no complaints, no regrets. Obviously, that wasn't the life path I chose. I wanted to do, but I made the best of it, and it's paid off. It's hard to explain to people that weren't that didn't live under the cloud of a military draft. It's not something you plan. The way for people that don't understand the draft, how it worked in those days, they would draw capsules out of 2 drums, like a bingo drum. They'd spin the drums and open the door and pull out a capsule with a number from 1 through 365. And then the second drum had capsules in it with all the days of the year, and they would draw a capsule from each drum, and then they would marry them together and say, well, if you were born on this date, this was your number, and the lower the number, the better the chance of being pulled into the military, and that's where I found myself. But again, I made the best of it, and no regrets.
And would you say being a veteran has helped you in that, like, maybe getting well, you do a lot of work with the state of Wisconsin, and does your veteran status at all help you with that?
Well, I think it doesn't help me qualify for any work, but I do think it gives me I think they feel what's the word, not sympathy but empathy.
Well, there's a slight preference. People want to see veterans succeed.
Sure, and they've been very they treated me very well. But we do a lot of work with the military in the States.
So your whole life, you've been following politics, following the United States military. So let's actually start talking about the war in Ukraine. And going back to February of last year, did you think Russia would actually do this? That Russia, because they every year were amassing troops on the border. There was always these headlines of, is Russia actually going to do it? No, it's just a war game exercise. But then this year was the real thing.
When I had when I had watched the news reports of what was going on in that part of the world, and when I heard and saw that the Russians were massing on the Ukrainian border, I was telling people, they're going. This is not a bluff. They're going to go. There's no. He's not going to put 100,000, 200,000 men there and all this equipment on a bluff. I knew that. I knew that from day one. That this was go. It was just a question of when, and he was going to pick his time, probably late winter, early spring. After the bad weather is done, and I didn't know. I don't think anybody knew how Ukraine was going to deal with that. I think Putin and the Russians just miscalculated. So there you are.
So do you want to give your analysis on Russia's performance so far?
Well, I think that they're and I'll be kind. I think their logistics, their tactical planning, have been abysmal, and I think a lot of their military strength is a myth that they put out there.
But I've seen the parades, Dad. Their parades are so nice.
Well, they do.
Surely their military is great.
Yeah, at Red Square, they do put on good parades. But one thing I noticed with all the soldiers, they all look the same, and they don't look like anyone who's actually fighting in the trenches in the Donbass.
All those pretty white boys from St. Petersburg marching in the parades. I don't see those guys on the front lines. Where are they?
I think they're being held in reserve for the parades. That's the feeling I get, and which they obviously feel are important.
The defense of Moscow from the next warlord that leads a coup. Someone once described to me, or I read it, these invasions. It's like someone takes a pail of water and throws it across a floor, and what happens is there's a tremendous amount of force coming out of the gates, coming out of that pail. But then as the water spreads out, it tends to slow down and lose its momentum, and then it stops. And that's where the Russians find themselves right now, is they've stopped, and that's a bad sign for them, where they've lost the initiative, they lost the ability to advance. They've retreated to trench lines, which is a surrender to a certain extent. It's like, well, we're going to try to hold on to what we've captured, conquer, negotiate, whatever you want to call it. And they're putting out all the signals that they want a ceasefire, a freeze in the conflict, and the whole point of this war was to liberate the Donbass region. And they're nowhere near taking the rest of Donetsk.
Yeah, and they wanted the rest of the coastline around the Sea of Azov. Obviously, they wanted that, and at the same time create a land bridge to Crimea. You could see that coming, and they've given up, at least for now, I think, capturing the rest of at least eastern Ukraine. I always thought when the war started that that if they had gotten to Kherson, and if they could have captured Kyiv, they could have come down the Dnieper River and split the country in two. In worst case scenario, they would have grabbed the whole eastern part of the country. I went early on when they were amassing for that war. I looked at Ukrainian maps and saw the Dnieper River as either a barrier for the Ukrainians, or just another obstacle to cross for the Russians, and here we are today, almost 2 years later, and they're not anywhere near the Dnieper except in the Kherson Oblast. So, but I think the water on the floor analogy is pretty accurate. I think they're just about spent, and what did we hear recently, that they're trying to buy back their artillery shells from the North Koreans, and to me that's a bad sign.
It's probably a poor investment. You sell something 40 years ago, and then you try and buy it back.
Well, then they have to worry about how the North Koreans stored all these artillery shells for the last 40 years or however long it's been.
Well, they stored them underground next to their kimchi jars.
Yeah, it's a tragedy, and there's no getting around that. I feel for the Ukrainian people, and yeah, what else can I say? Support Ukraine. I tell people here to support Ukraine. I can't vote because I'm not a U.S. citizen, but if I could, it would be for political leaders here in this country who support Ukraine.
So going back to the start of the war, why do you think Putin did it? What do you think was the number one and the number two reason why Putin did this?
Well, without giving him too much credit, I think it was partly for nationalistic reasons, reestablishing the old Soviet borders. I believe there's some validity in that. I think it's partly economic. Ukraine has a lot of resources. It has, like the Midwest here in the United States, it has deep soils for great agriculture. There's, if you look at the flag behind me here, the yellow represents, I believe, the wheat fields, farm fields of Ukraine, and so they're proud of that. And Russia eyed that, I'm sure, to help feed its population, and wanted the farmland. They wanted the industrial complex in Ukraine. They wanted the coastlines. They wanted the offshore resources, the oil and gas, no question about that. So I think it was partly Russian pride coming out, and ambition, Putin's ambition, and struggle for the resources. And I don't think that's anything new. I mean, that's been going on for centuries, thousands of years. Countries eyeing resources of their neighbors, wanting them. Of course, today you can't go to war without everyone seeing it. Everyone has a camera. You have the internet. You can post things. It's a whole different world than it was in 1971 when I was 18. So I don't. You can't. The American military is just with what we invest in the military. It's just you just don't want to go head to head with the American military. So Russia, I'm sure they I'm sure they calculated that we wouldn't support the Ukrainians, or we wouldn't support them as long as we have. I think they underestimated our cooperation with the EU, and which the EU has come a long way in this struggle. So here they find themselves, and they sit in the Kremlin and try to plan what do we do next. And I'm sure they lose a lot of sleep at night trying to figure out where we go from here. So
Russia was supposed to be the world's second most powerful military. That's what everyone was saying 2 years ago. Why do you think the Russians have so severely underperformed?
Well, I think corruption has been a big problem in Russia. I saw a video months ago, someone describing the corruption problems down the whole chain of command in the military, and eventually when their war effort finally comes out of the barrel of a gun, there was just nothing left, or so depleted that it was ineffective, and where everyone's skimming for their own personal reasons, and that, and the fact that they've let their tactics and logistics lag modern warfare. I think the Ukrainians have done a better job of adapting to this war than I think the Russians have. I read a book years ago called "Now It Can Be Told." It was written by a British correspondent sitting in the trenches on the Western Front during World War I, and he wrote something that I read and just struck me, which was both sides in World War I spent the first 2 years of the war. Now this is after millions of people have died. The first 2 years of the war just figuring out how to fight the war, because they had no idea how that war was going to go. And to me, that's sort of what's happened in Ukraine. Is they all sort of had the Russians. I'm speaking about the Russians now. They had an idea how this would go, and it didn't even take 2 years for them to figure out that it wasn't going to go the way they had planned. So some people say that when the war starts, you can throw the plan away on day one, and there's a lot of truth in that. So they just plan wrong, and from the get-go, and I think the Ukrainians probably had no plan whatsoever, but they got up to speed much faster, and have stopped that water coming at them, and now and they've reached that 2-year point now, like they did in World War I. Everybody's figured out how this is going to happen, and now it's a question of who can react the fastest.
So you hadn't seen that Sean Penn documentary Superpower on Paramount Plus. We watched that together last night, and it has that incredible video the day of the invasion of Sean Penn talking with President Zelensky. So I just want to ask, what's your thoughts and opinions on President Zelensky and how he's managed this war? Well,
I think the turning point in the war, the first turning point, let's call it that, in the war, happened when Zelensky said, "I don't need a ride, I need ammunition." That was the turning point for Ukraine, because that's the point where I heard, at least, that they weren't going to cut and run. They were going to stay there and fight. And that's the first decision you have to make, I guess, is that you're going to stay and fight, and that's the decision he made. And his soldiers reacted to that. Obviously, at the beginning of that documentary, his own soldiers were saying that they didn't think he was, I guess, had it in him to stay and fight. But then at the end of that documentary, after everything that had transpired in the last, when was the documentary made after the start of the war? 6 months or?
Well, the documentary was released this month, but Sean Penn has been filming for 3 years.
So So his men, I think, were surprised and rewarded that they had stayed with him, and that Zelensky had stood his ground. And to me that was the real turning point when they decided they were going to stay and fight for this thing called Ukraine and democracy.
Any other thoughts since that turning point?
No, it's unfortunately, I think the war is going to go on for a while. It's a slog, and I think that the side that can get out of their trenches first is going to win the war. And I think to date it's been primarily a artillery and drone war. And I think that doesn't bode well for armies that sit in trenches, and I think if the Ukrainians can poke a hole in the line, as they say, I think that they can get their armor on the move, their tanks on the move, which I think they've been holding back because that's not what tanks were intended to do, hold back. They were intended to be on offense. And you know, the Allies discovered this in World War I. They discovered in World War II that they didn't want their armies sitting in trenches because that's not how you win wars. And the Russians seem to be content with doing that, or impotent to change their tactics. You know, one or the other. So I think if Ukraine can just manage to breach a defense line somewhere and pour their armor through there, then they can get the Russians panicked and pulling back.
Do you think the United States and the Western Alliance, you know, NATO, the EU, do you think they actually will support Ukraine for as long as it takes?
Well, I hope they do. And we talked about this earlier. I'm suspicious of the Europeans.
You can be honest.
I'm just being honest.
You're European. I'm
a European, and well, a part of me is, you know, because I said earlier I'm also an American, but I do worry about the Europeans because you know, it's a diverse culture there. It's 30 some countries. They all have their priorities. They have prejudices. You know, they're just human, and so we'll see what happens. I hope the European Union stays with it because I just don't think they have an option. They share a landmass with the Russians that aren't going to stop, and unlike the Americans who benefit from an ocean between us and the Russians, Europe doesn't. So that's, you know, that's just some thoughts. Now, I should say that I'm a casual observer of this war. I'm not an expert on this. I've never been to Ukraine. I don't know any Ukrainians. I read magazines, newspapers. I've read a lot of books about Europe, a lot of books about European wars. I draw from all of that. I watch YouTube. There's some very good channels on YouTube, and try to piece it together to form, I think, an honest opinion of what I see, and then based on my own experience, my own life experience.
So if Russia manages to hold on to occupied territory and some kind of armistice is signed, do you think that's the end of it, or do you think Russia will keep going?
No. They're not going to stop. They're not going to stop. That's a fantasy, and they're, you know, what they'll do is if you give them the land bridge, they're going to digest that, and then they're going to come back in a few years for more. They're not going to stop. It would take a change of government. I don't know that it would take just a change of someone at the top. Maybe that's unfair to the Russian people, but If there are other people in the Kremlin that think like Putin, then they won't stop. That they're gonna continue on and on and on. There'll be no peace in that part of the world. I think they have to see this out, and they have to see every square foot of Ukrainian territory return to Ukraine, and I hope that's what happens.
So the other scenario then, Russia actually militarily loses and is eventually expelled from the occupied territories. Do you think the modern state, its 1993 borders, can the modern state of Russia hold itself together as not an authoritarian state?
Well, I would prefer to see Russia stay together as something other than an authoritarian state. I'm not quite sure what that is yet. They flirted with democracy at the end of the Cold War. That didn't survive. I would hope that they could become a democratic state, but I don't know. They don't have like the West. They don't have a culture of that, a history of that. They have corruption they have to clean up in that country. But if it's also very possible that they'll fracture. Because they cover what 10 time zones, something like that. It's an enormous landmass, and it's hard to hold together. And I think the monster the czars created has come back to haunt them. That's what I like to think. They put it all together over a course of hundreds of years. Not unlike the English did here in this country, but in this country they've done a better job of keeping things together than I think the Russians have had. So,
how worried are you of the scenario of loose nukes? That if the central government of Russia can't control itself, and they've got 6,000 nuclear warheads spread out all across their territory, how big of a concern do you think it is of one of these nuclear weapons being sold or being appropriated by a warlord?
Well, I think that is a concern. That's a legitimate concern. So yeah, who do you want these nukes? Whose hands do you want these in? The Russian military or worse? Again, I'm not an expert. I don't know where these nukes are located. If they're located in the western part, within the control of Moscow, I think we're safe. But if they're located, if they have nukes in Vladivostok or the far eastern part of the country, in the middle of the country, and Russia splinters, yeah, it's a good question. What happens to those weapons?
I can answer that question. They're everywhere. They're on
everywhere.
boats. They're on trains. Yeah. They're in mountains. They're on road mobiles. In the forests.
I heard too that they had them on trucks, which just is for defensive purposes where they can hide these things. But yeah, that's a scary thought. Yeah, here the government controls these weapons pretty closely, and so yeah, that is a concern. I don't have an answer for that. I'm sure it keeps the American military up at night, worrying about that.
If Russia struggles to hold itself together politically, what do you think China would do?
If Russia stayed together politically, what would China do? Probably.
Well, if Russia doesn't.
Oh, stay together.
Yeah.
Oh, I think that yeah. Who was I heard someone on one of these channels talking about that the Chinese look at the resources in eastern Russia like a dog views a T-bone steak, and where if Russia stumbles in the West, all those stakes in Eastern Russia are free for the picking. So yeah, I'm just like the Germans and the Russians formed an alliance for a short period of time at the beginning of World War II. When I see Russia and China flirting with some kind of an alliance or agreement, I just kind of laugh, because I don't think that's gonna last. China only cares about China, and if they have an opportunity in Russian territory where they can grab something, I think they'd do it, if there was no retribution, no response because of some political chaos in Western Russia. I think they'd do it in a minute.
If China attacked Russia, tried to reclaim outer Manchuria, I think you told me once that the Russians would actually try and ask NATO for help.
Well, I think Russia missed the boat 30 years ago with the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think they should have tried to join NATO. That they had their opportunity. They should have joined the EU, but they chose a different path, and here we are. So yeah, I think it's possible that they would ask us for help.
Kind of like with World War II.
With World War II.
That grand alliance with the Nazis didn't seem to work too well.
Well, yeah, I've as I said earlier, I've read a lot of books about World War I and World War II and European history, and some of the things that happened. You couldn't write better. You couldn't write better fiction than the things that actually happened in Europe. So,
on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most, 1 being the least, how committed do you think mainland China is to invading Taiwan?
Well, I think that I think they want Taiwan back, and I think historically, again, I'm not an expert. I think historically Taiwan was part of China, and they believe that gives them license to want it back. But that's like saying, well, Texas was part of Mexico at one time, and Texas or Mexico they have no claim on Texas today. So I could say the same thing about Taiwan and China, but I think that with everything going on in Taiwan, I'm sure they view it as territory they want back for its resources and everything it has to offer.
It's the first island chain. They just want a strategic outpost to extend.
Yeah, and if you look at what China's doing in the South China Sea, they think that's the China Lake, and no one comes into our lake, and that's just crazy. That's crazy talk. And then when you see them building airstrips on sandbars in the middle of the China Sea, you have to ask yourself, well, what's going on there? Again, another thing that keeps American military planners up at night. And of course, that's creating all kinds of problems with Vietnam. Yeah, Vietnam is now our friends because of what's going on in China. And the Vietnamese don't like China, even though China helped them during the Vietnam War. But they're nervous as hell about what China's doing in there, because now if they control the sea, then they control a long coastline that Vietnam has. And the same thing with the Philippines
and Malaysia.
And Malaysia, yeah, the whole region. It's destabilizing the whole region. And on what grounds? China doesn't have any claims there beyond a 12-mile border. So I think China is like Russia. It was not blessed geographically like America was. We have long coastlines on 2 oceans, and then we're friends with Canada, which controls the 3rd ocean, the Arctic Ocean, or at least has access to it, and China doesn't have that, and Russia doesn't have that. So yeah, they're very envious of us, and we take advantage of it, which is why America's it's a world power. It's we call the shots right now. So
So do you think it's likely, or the media is overreacting?
no, I don't think they're overreacting. I think they should shine a light on what's going on in Taiwan. They should keep focus on Taiwan, and I think I can't get into Xi's head, um, but they could be China takes the long view on everything because they have such a long history, and they I think they take the view that, well, let's see what happens. Let's see what happens with EU and America in Ukraine, and if there's a weakness there, if there's failure there, and Russia prevails, maybe that's our opportunity. So I think and again, this all circles back to what's going on in Europe, and how the West has to prevail in Europe. They have to prevail in Ukraine, because I think it would just give China an opportunity, and I think they're just waiting. They're waiting to see what happens, and now there may be some in China that say, well, we have to strike now, because I think they believe America can't walk and chew gum at the same time. They can't deal with two problems like this at the same time. I'm sure that debate is going on. It's complicated because we're economically tied to China. They depend on us, we depend on them. That if there's war, that would all be upset, and
Nobody's getting their new iPhones.
Nobody's getting their perfect iPhones. If there's war with China, yeah, that would just be a disaster. So, and I'm sure there are elements in the Chinese government that favor more cooperation with us. They don't want trouble with us, and so those are all things that you have to just wait for them to play out. And this is why it's important to elect, in America, to elect responsible adults for government positions. We should have the best of the brightest in the breast sitting, the best sitting in the House of Representatives, in the Senate, and the White House. We need good people there, people that are smart. A nice mix of ex-military people, I think, is very useful, and we do have a lot of bright veterans in Congress.
Are you saying Matt Gaetz is not smart?
Well, if Matt Gaetz could show me discharge papers, honorable discharge papers from the Marine Corps or the Army, the Air Force, or Navy, that would get me on the road maybe to lightening up on him a little bit. But
he served his time in the Bahamas.
In the Bahamas, yes. Yeah, I don't want to talk about Matt Gaetz, so not today.
So the big news story, I haven't made a video of what's happening, but Israel has declared war. This is the first time Israel's declared war since the Yom Kippur War. What year was that?
Well, yeah, the last time Israel declared war was in 1973, coincidentally in October of 1973, when I was in the Air Force. That was the 6-Day War. Yeah, it was the 6-Day War, I believe.
Were you on high alert?
I was on vacation. I had gone on vacation with a buddy of mine. We drove my Volkswagen up to Northern California, up to San Francisco, and we wanted to see something of the Golden State. And so yeah, we were basically disconnected from newspapers and media and whatnot. And while we were disconnected, war broke out. And so when we got back off of vacation, this was a week later, or 3 days later, whatever it was, there was a war going on. And of course, by then I had already signed back in. And then they told me, well, that's great, good timing, because we need you as a policeman now. And so I said, well, can I sign back out? And they said, nope, too late. Can't sign back out on vacation. So yeah, I became a police augmentee. So I did that for the next 2 or 3 weeks.
And you stood guard at the gate in San Bernardino, California, to help keep the world safe.
Yeah, and we did keep it safe. Absolutely. Look how successful we were. So, but again, 50 years later, here we are again with war declared between Israel and a Arab state. It's sad. It's a sad state of affairs. You know.
How do you think the next week or two is going to play out?
It's not going to be good. I think unless they can come to some kind of a negotiated ceasefire, you know, something to settle this quickly, and maybe you know maybe the Americans can get involved in that, or the Europeans, or the Saudis. You know, I believe the Saudis can talk to both sides. I don't. They might be of some use. I don't know. I guess we'll see. But I feel for the average Palestinian and the average Israeli that are getting caught up in this struggle and paying the price for it, unfortunately.
Do you think Hezbollah in Lebanon or Iran will get involved?
Well, I think Iran already is involved. You know, if Hamas is firing guided rockets, so these are advanced rockets out of Gaza. Where did they get the rockets? They didn't build these things in Gaza. They got them. They must have gotten them from Iran. So I think I think Iran is already involved. Hezbollah, I don't know about Hezbollah. They may just rattle some swords and just announce they're still relevant. But Lebanon has a lot of problems that Hezbollah has to respect. I don't know that they can get involved in a war right now with Israel. Boy, I don't know. The last time they went to war, I don't think it worked out well for Hezbollah. So
these Iranian rockets that are getting into the Gaza Strip, you think they have to be coming in through the Egyptian border?
Well, they're either coming in. Well, again, I'm not an authority. I think they're either coming in by sea in small boats that aren't detected by the Israelis, or they're coming in across the border with Egypt, which raises lots of questions about what's Egypt's involvement in all this, and they're coming in through tunnels. Obviously, if they're not coming in on the surface, they're probably coming in from tunnels. And I thought they dealt with these tunnels after the last dust up with Hamas, but apparently not. So that has to be addressed. And they're obviously stored in tunnels under Gaza. I've heard Gaza has a vast tunnel network, and well, I guess for protection from bombings, things like that, and that's fair. But I think to use them for military purposes is probably not advised.
So going back to Ukraine, there's a lot of people in Ukraine who watch my videos, a lot of people in Eastern Europe. Mm-hmm. Do you have any thoughts or advice to them?
Well, no, I don't want to tell them what to do. I would say try to keep a positive attitude and keep faith in your leaders and in your military. I think they're doing a great job, and pray for Zelensky, and keep him safe, obviously, and if it gets difficult, evacuate and get out of the battle zones. You definitely want to do that if you can, So, but yeah, beyond that, I don't know what to tell the people of Ukraine. I think it'd be a little presumptuous sitting here in America, I can't imagine the horror of it all. I've never been in war. I was not a combatant. I was in the military, but I served statesides during the Vietnam War. I've seen it. I've only seen it from afar, and I've listened to stories, the occasional stories from my parents, who survived World War II, and we can only imagine. So I pray for the Ukrainians. I support the Ukrainians, and I hope they prevail. I think, and this may sound harsh, but I think the Russians need to be crushed, ground to dust, and the dust burned. That's what needs to happen, so that they don't do this anymore, that they just stop. They're just be happy with what you have, and let that be the end of it.
Stop trying to take other people's things.
Yeah, that's you can't do that in America. You can buy their things, you can give them something in exchange for it, but you can't take someone else's things. And it seems to me that's what the Russians are doing, and that's just not right. And to the average American, I think they understand that, which is why vast majority of Americans support Biden and our government in support of Ukraine. They just see it's unfair. They don't like bullies. They don't like big countries beating up on small countries, and they think it's unfair.
So that's going to wrap up this podcast. Me and my dad, we're actually seeing a Monday night football game today at Allegiant Stadium. It's going to be the Green Bay Packers versus the Las Vegas Raiders.
Go Pack!
So we're gonna go get dinner on the Strip and continue enjoying our weekends
and continue this discussion.
But yeah, a lot of news, a lot of events. We'll get this podcast up tomorrow, and maybe the next time my dad visits. If you guys enjoyed this conversation, we can talk some more. Let me know in a comment down below. I always love hearing from you guys. My dad watches all my videos. He's my #1 fan. So,
yep. Thank you, Jake. And I hope I didn't embarrass you today.
Not at all.
I hope not. So
all right.
Thank you. Go, yeah.
Till the next video. Take care, everyone.
Go Ukraine.